Paradox of flight and the salami slicing tactic. A brutal systemic crisis is unfolding in plain sight within the real estate market of Sevastopol. This strategic port city on the occupied Crimean peninsula is witnessing a total economic inversion. Luxury seaside villas with prime waterfront views were valued at millions of dollars before the conflict. Now, these properties are being abandoned in haste by the Russian elite as the tide of evacuation surges. Traditional financial metrics and economic laws on the peninsula have completely disintegrated. Leaked field reports log an extreme phenomenon. Fleeing residents are liquidating fixed real estate at catastrophic losses of up to 80%. They are willingly sacrificing high-value mobile assets. They want to secure a single vital resource. That resource is a mere 100 liters of gasoline for their escape back to the mainland. This is not a sensationalized media narrative manufactured for clicks. This is raw field intelligence. It confirms that the entire civilian economy is frozen. The logistical supply chains of this supposedly impregnable fortress are entering a state of total stagnation. The peninsula is under asymmetric strangulation, when a domestic currency loses all utility and is replaced by liquid fuel. The reality is clear. The logistical arteries connecting Crimea to the outside world have been severed. Mainstream Western media remains fixated on the loud, attritional artillery duels along the eastern front lines. However, data from open-source intelligence analysts at the Vanguard Report exposes a far deeper strategic reality. International military observers frequently ask a skeptical question. They wonder why Ukraine refuses to destroy the Kerch Bridge immediately. Western allies have supplied Ukraine with high precision, devastating long-range weaponry. Yet, the Ukrainian military chooses a prolonged, incremental campaign utilizing cheap unmanned aerial vehicles. The answer lies in a ruthless asymmetric military doctrine executed by the Ukrainian General Staff. From an OSINT perspective, a total demolition of the bridge in a single night is a mistake. It would corner the entire Russian garrison and administrative apparatus on the peninsula. This triggers a dangerous psychological effect. The adversary would have no choice but to dig in and fight fanatically at all costs. Instead, Ukraine chooses to execute a calculated strategy of denial. This is historically known as the salami slicing tactic. The essence of this tactic is systematic deconstruction. Ukraine strips away the enemy defensive capabilities one piece at a time. They do not waste expensive cruise missiles against the heavily reinforced concrete pillars of the $4 billion bridge. Instead, Ukraine deploys long-range kamikaze drone swarms. These work in close coordination with Vanguard naval drones. These maritime assets cost only a few tens of thousands of dollars to produce. The objective of these continuous strikes is not immediate structural collapse. The goal is the systematic destruction of substations to sever the electrical grid. They incinerate strategic military fuel depots. They isolate the maritime logistical ferry terminals across the Kerch Strait. The deployment of Magura 5 maritime drones has a specific target. They hunt down and eliminate Russia outer patrol vessels. This has completely neutralized their naval transport capacity. Ferry terminals are heavily damaged. Cargo ships cannot dock due to the risk of being sunk. As a result, the entire supply burden of the peninsula is forced back onto a single, vulnerable overland route. The Institute for the Study of War in Washington recently released its latest analytical assessment. It states that the asymmetric logistical blockade is designed for one ultimate objective. That objective is weaponizing panic. Ukraine deliberately leaves the Kerch Bridge as the sole remaining exit route. At the same time, they subject it to constant kinetic threats, non-stop red alerts, severe traffic gridlock. This pressure forces the entire political apparatus, the oligarchs, and the Russian elite into a state of self-induced hysteria. It compels them to flee and hollow out the peninsula from within. This method brings down a fortress without requiring Ukraine to sacrifice manpower in a direct ground assault. And this engineered collapse is already in motion. It is triggered by a classified evacuation list compiled by the highest-ranking authorities on the peninsula themselves. The elite priority list and the $12 billion dead corridor. The epicenter of this systemic chaos stems from a highly classified evacuation document. It was leaked from sources close to the Russian security apparatus. This crisis is projected to affect approximately 250,000 personnel. Field data is based on unverified reports transmitted by the Atesh partisan movement, operating deep inside the peninsula. This 10% of the population does not represent random ordinary civilians. These sources assert that this is a strictly vetted priority roster. It is engineered specifically to rescue the Occupation Administration. It targets high-ranking military commanders and officers of the Federal Security Service, or FSB, along with their families. Many international military analysts observe the sheer scale of this evacuation. They frequently raise a critical question. They wonder why the Kremlin refuses to utilize the existing railway infrastructure on the Kerch Bridge. That rail line could rapidly clear the human bottleneck. Instead, the administration leaves civilians stranded on the highway. From a logistical intelligence perspective, the answer lies in the extreme vulnerability of the rail infrastructure. Railways are fixed and rigid. They are exceptionally easy to neutralize. A single precision strike by a cruise missile would instantly freeze this vital artery for weeks. It could hit a section of the tracks or a fuel transport train. The Russian elite and security operatives understand this completely. They cannot cram their families into train cars. Those cars act as mobile sitting targets while the peninsula air defense umbrella has been depleted. They deliberately accept the gridlock of personal vehicles. This allows for rapid flight, dispersion, and concealment the moment air defense sirens wail. The decay and panic within the ruling apparatus in Crimea have spilled over the margins of leaked documents. The situation is exploding into internal armed conflicts over fleeing resources. Independent intelligence channels have continuously logged unverified reports regarding a shocking incident. It occurred at major fuel storage facilities on the outskirts of Sevastopol. An armed group was reportedly led by a former Wagner commander. They launched a surprise raid. They overpowered the security details and seized control of the entire fuel depot. Local police forces intervened to restore order. However, the armed faction produced an emergency decree. It was signed by the head of the occupation administration. The document authorized them to confiscate all remaining gasoline reserves. This fuel was reserved exclusively for the evacuation of top-tier officials. Russia-owned armed factions are now fighting over the last drops of gasoline on social media platforms. This serves as powerful intelligence indicators. It proves that faith in Moscow control has completely disintegrated. This reality has engineered a profound and ruthless class betrayal on the ground. Commercial satellite imagery from Planet Labs exposes a deeply infuriating contrast with 100% certainty. Convoys of trucks belonging to the Russian security apparatus utilize specialized priority lanes. They use them to liquidate and evacuate assets back to the mainland. Meanwhile, thousands of ordinary civilians are subjected to draconian fuel rationing. They receive just 20 liters per day per vehicle. They are left stranded in a 15-kilometer gridlock at checkpoints leading to the Kerch Bridge. They endure over 5 hours of exposure and absolute futility. Many conventional news channels attempt to downplay the severity of the crisis. They argue that Russia's $12 billion land corridor project will act as the ultimate salvation. This route runs through occupied northern territories like Mariupol and Berdyansk. However, official declassified intelligence reports from the British Ministry of Defense present a completely opposite conclusion. This $12 billion route may serve as a theoretical logistical solution for Moscow. It allows them to force armored military supply trains to the front lines. But from an intelligence standpoint, it is a dead corridor for the large-scale civilian evacuation. Mapping data confirms this highway runs dangerously close to the front lines. It sits entirely within the high-precision targeting and strike envelope of Ukrainian HIMARS artillery and FPV drone swarms. Any attempt to evacuate a population mass of 250,000 people through this route would result in a tactical disaster. It exposes vital assets to concentrated fire. This explains why the Kerch Bridge remains the solitary lifeline. Despite being under critical threat, the Russian elite must cling to it for survival. The symbolic collapse and the strategic dilemma. The systemic collapse of Fortress Crimea is not an isolated event. It is directly linked to a cascading strategic error that we exposed in our previous report. Based on commercial satellite imagery from Maxar and Planet Labs, the Kremlin made a fatal decision. They withdrew advanced Panzer S-1 air defense systems from critical border sectors. They used them to establish a protective umbrella over oligarch estates in Rubliovka. This area sits on the outskirts of Moscow. As a result, Crimean airspace was inadvertently left in a highly vulnerable defensive state. Prioritizing the assets of Russia ultra-wealthy over vital logistical lifelines created a fatal air defense deficit. This allowed cheap Ukrainian drone swarms to freely penetrate the peninsula boundaries. Now, they are tightening the logistical noose. Confronted with the depletion of overland logistical capacity, many international observers raise a core question. They wonder why Russia refuses to deploy the naval power of the notorious Black Sea Fleet. That fleet could establish a maritime bridge for fuel replenishment. It could provide evacuation support. The answer lies in a brutal reality verified by Western intelligence. The Black Sea Fleet has been entirely stripped of its strategic combat capabilities. Coordinated asymmetric strikes utilize Storm Shadow cruise missiles and maritime drones. These attacks previously forced the Russian Navy to panic. They evacuated all remaining capital ships from fortified bases in Crimea. Satellite imagery confirms they had to accept a retreat of over 300 nautical miles. They sought refuge in the Taman Peninsula and the port of Novorossiysk. This port is deep within the Russian mainland. The waters surrounding Crimea have now become a zone of denial for the Russian Navy itself. This reality renders any attempt to open a maritime supply line tactically impossible. This total paralysis across land, rail, and sea routes has left the nuclear doctrine of the Russian Federation completely immobile. Many Western audiences frequently express concern over a nuclear escalation scenario in the comment sections. This fear arises when Ukraine targets Crimea. The peninsula has long been designated as President Putin's ultimate red line. However, our strategic analysts point out a different reality. Ukraine is playing a highly sophisticated siege game. This game is based on an accurate reading of Russian public legal documents. The Russian nuclear doctrine explicitly dictates that weapons of mass destruction can only be activated under two conditions. The first condition is being struck by nuclear weapons first. The second condition is facing a large-scale conventional ground invasion that threatens the very existence of the state. Ukraine is deliberately avoiding a total ground offensive. They focus strictly on economic degradation and logistical blockades. By doing this, Ukraine completely avoids triggering the Kremlin nuclear retaliation clauses. President Putin is pushed into a state of strategic impotence. A superpower cannot launch intercontinental ballistic missiles merely to resolve a fuel shortage. They cannot use them for a localized grid collapse or a civilian traffic jam of officials on a bridge. Nuclear weapons suddenly become entirely useless against unmanned aerial vehicles costing a few tens of thousands of dollars. The theater sinks deeper into this war of attrition. As it does, the lifeline of Crimea is narrowing to a suffocating choke point. The frontline defensive lines may collapse entirely. If they do, a chaotic retreat of Russian armed forces will surge southward. In that scenario, the $4 billion Kerch Bridge will instantly transform. It will change from a route of hope into a massive tactical trap with no escape. When that decisive moment arrives, Vladimir Putin will face the most bitter and desperate decision of his political career. He may have to order the deliberate destruction of the greatest symbolic monument built by Russia itself. He would do this solely to prevent Ukrainian forces from utilizing the bridge as a highway into the Russian mainland. The Vanguard Report intelligence assessment on the crisis in Crimea concludes here: the latest developments on the battlefield and global strategic shifts will continually be updated, uncovered, and analyzed by our team. If you value these deep, independent insights driven by verified open-source data, please hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave your perspective in the comments below. Your support is the driving force for us. It allows us to continue exposing strategic secrets in our upcoming reports. Thank you, and goodbye.